My name is Seth Robertson. I am Vice President and Director of Funding and Asset Management for WithersRavenel. I also have Jessica Leggett with me today, and she's our funding team lead. So she's going to be monitoring the Q&A and helping tee up questions. And if they're, pretty straightforward, she'll probably be answering some of those questions directly in the QA as well. I already see some stuff starting to come in. We'll talk about, kind of, like I said, as much of this as we can. So let's kind of get into this. One thing I will say is this will be um, focused on North Carolina since that's where most of our attendees are from. So it is kind of directed that way, but most of this information is going to apply broadly. Today, we're going to focus mostly on the money that's being made directly to local government, since that's obviously sort of the big deal and the big change that we saw in the ARPA or American Rescue Plan Act, as opposed to some of the previous CARES Act type funding that has been made available throughout the COVID pandemic. Again, I'll try to point out things that are specific to North Carolina. We have some specific resources at the end that kind of lead into that as well. But glad to answer any other general questions as they would apply basically anywhere at this point. And we're not going to get a ton into the state money. I'll talk about it a little bit since it's still unclear how they're going to do that and how they're going to administer it, but we'll talk about it a little bit. So kind of where are we today? Obviously, ARPA is kind of the term that's being used now, or ARP. It was signed into law on March 11th. It's now the third or fourth version of funding that we've received during the pandemic. This was a different structure than what we've seen in some of the earlier ones. I think this is the first time now we're seeing money not so much as a triage to what's happening for COVID, but more of a how do we get back to pre-COVID? How do we start kind of moving forward from an economic standpoint, an assistance standpoint, an investment standpoint, especially in infrastructure as we get to those pieces. So we're obviously here today because the interim rule and the guidance was published in the Federal Register. It actually got officially published on May 17th. It was last week that it got distributed out along with guidance. They'll be taking comments until mid-July. July 16th is the date based upon that publishing date. They've already started receiving some comments and looking at just this morning, I think they had 7 or 8 comments already. If you read the guidance, you'll see it's still pretty open. There's questions, in fact, that the Treasury is posing to people reading the guidance that they would like specific feedback on. So I'm going to encourage everybody. It's a big document. I think it's about 150 pages in my version that I've looked at, but I think it's worth reading through the document and especially looking at the questions they're asking. And if there's things that we talk about today that are unclear, and there will be, it's time to get that clarification. So there's still an opportunity right now, and I kind of urge everybody to take advantage of that while you still can. And obviously the first tranche of funds is currently being distributed. So the way that's happening is roughly 50% are being distributed now to people, hitting first to counties, the large municipalities, and to the states. And now we're in the process of people that have the non-entitlement communities of requesting their funds from the state through that pass-through. Just real briefly, here in North Carolina, they've started doing some training for that. I know the League of Municipalities had some training last week with the pandemic office, which is where those requests are coming through. I've got a link at the end, but basically they've got a pre-contracting document up there that will give you the kind of the outline and the basis for you requesting your funding. They actually asked that those requests come in from local governments by yesterday. From my experience, it looks like some knew, some didn't know, but something you certainly want to work on sooner rather than later is getting the information to the state and the pandemic office here in North Carolina to be able to get your first tranche of funds as soon as possible. Though you may not want to appropriate those too soon, and we'll talk about that as well. So the totals in North Carolina, just really quickly, cities between the large municipalities and the non-entitlement communities, which is what most of the communities are in the state that are towns and cities, is $1.4 billion. So that's the direct money. Counties are directly getting $2 billion. And, as important as that money is, there's also a huge piece that's going to the state. So we're looking at about $5.6 billion here in North Carolina. That will ultimately be decided by the legislature of how that money is split into the different categories and how it's allocated. In the governor's budget and what we're seeing out of the legislature, I think there is a substantial desire to put that money into infrastructure projects, and we'll talk about again those categories in a second. I've heard anything from $200 or $300 million to up to $1 billion being discussed as possibility to kind of fund that type of infrastructure. There's obviously a huge need there. We don't know what programs this we're going to go through, but I'm assuming it's going to involve things like Division Water Infrastructure, probably Commerce Department for some of these funds. It's going to be a variety of different kind of agencies within the state likely they're going to be involved along with the pandemic office. And that's a total of almost $9 billion in North Carolina. And if you're in other states, obviously you're getting your own portions of this money, and it's a huge piece no matter where you are. So let's look at the eligibility. So originally coming out of it, there was 4 primary categories. I'm actually breaking it into 5 here because the guidance effectively takes the number 1 category and breaks it into 2. And the good news is in the guidance is it's pretty open right now for a lot of these different things. And one of the things they continue to use in their terminology is non-exclusive lists of eligibility. So the things we're going to talk about today, they indicate are not, the exclusive uses. We don't know what the process is yet to either request additional eligibilities, get a determination from Treasury, or the process of you going through your own determinations and justifying that ultimately when all of this is said and done. But here's the 5 primary things that we have. So the first is responding to COVID-19. And a lot of this is based on the same things that CARES Act could do. So public health expenditures, mitigation efforts, medical expenses, etc. There's some new things here, and we'll talk about them a little bit. One of the things it addresses in the guidance, and I think we're definitely seeing that now that it's finally out, as opposed to where we were even back in the March timeframe when some of this was originally getting passed into law, is we're seeing that most states, North Carolina included, are making some substantial transitions from the PPE and the protection to opening back up to lessening restrictions. So some of the things that are here are not necessarily, I don't think, going to apply very well at this point going forward, the way they're written. So they either need to probably open them up some, or it's just going to limit what people are probably going to try to put money in at the end of the day, because we have moved into a different phase of the pandemic at this point. They do acknowledge that in the guidance, that depending on what happens with the pandemic, some of these things may not be needed. So you certainly don't have to spend money on all of these, and you've got a lot of flexibility as a community to decide what's important to you and what the needs are in the community as well. The second is responding to negative economic impacts, and I think this reflects some of those changes, including some of the long-term impacts to certain entities in the public sector. Can still do things for households, small business, impacted industries. It's going to talk specifically about tourism, hospitality, and travel. Those are called out by name. But again, it's focused a lot on reopening, and I'm not so sure we haven't already hit those thresholds for the things that it was being considered in the guidance. Premium pay is number 3. Again, I'll kind of say a similar thing here. I'm not sure how much additional premium pay from this point forward is really going to come into effect for essential workers, especially now that a lot of guidelines are being dropped and we don't have, the mask requirements. We don't have the limitations of the number of people that can gather, those type of things. Revenue loss, I think, is a big one, but it's not going to apply to everybody. Basically, this is the widest eligibility is if you had specific revenue loss over the year, and there's a very specific calculation that's pretty detailed, and we'll talk about it a little, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because it's going to be very specific to every local government. Anything that kind of falls under general services, you're going to be able to do those things to the extent you had a revenue loss. So the amount of that loss is going to have to correlate to the amount of money you're allowed to spend on those activities. And then the big one, where I think a lot of need exists and where a lot of money is probably going to end up going because it's pretty open, and there's a lot of availability of funding and need in this, is investments in infrastructure, in particular water, sewer, and broadband. Broadband's going to be a little tricky depending on where you are in North Carolina and who you are because of existing statutory limitations. Another thing that we're going to be looking out for is when the legislature takes this up, do they make some other changes in the existing statutes to allow municipalities to take in counties, because that's one of the big issues for broadband, of all of these things to their fullest extent, or are they still going to have those limitations here in North Carolina? So, as important as what's eligible is what's not eligible for the American Rescue Plan. Two are really specifically called out. The other two are kind of repeated throughout that have made them effectively non-eligible as well. So the first thing is deposit into pension funds. So this can't be used to prop up a pension fund. It doesn't include normal contributions as part of, for instance, premium pay, those monthly contributions that would be supported by the premium pay, but you're not going to be able to say, hey, we got a shortfall, we're going to move this into a pension fund. The second is an offset of reduction in net tax revenue. And this had a lot of comment, I think, early. Basically, the idea was you can't cut your taxes or other tax type revenues and supplement that with this money to make up that difference. It doesn't mean you can't cut taxes, whether it's the state or whether it's a local government. I'm going to say I wouldn't recommend it while using this money because I think even if it's not going to offset that tax decrease, the amount of paperwork and the justification is probably going to be pretty onerous, and you're not going to want to do that unless you absolutely have to. Because I suspect the assumption from the Treasury and the federal government is that's what you're doing, and you're going to have to prove that's not what you're doing. So I would say tread very carefully down that road if that's the direction you want to go in. The third is a big one because this question has actually come up from a lot of people early is can we take this money, especially and pay off existing debt service that's at higher interest rates, even if we want to turn around and take out additional loans at lower interest rates? It looks pretty clear to me the way the guidance is written, you cannot use any of this funding for debt issuance or to pay off any existing debt service. So that's not going to be in the mix here. There's a couple things to do that. It's called out specifically, but it also talks about basically anything that were costs occurred prior to March 3rd of this year. So if that was incurred, that also knocks it out kind of from two-pronged approach. So not debt service, not legal settlements or judgments. I think there's some question there of how would this follow into like an administrative order. I think if you did work related to that administrative order, there could be issues depending on how you have to document it that we don't know yet. And general infrastructure spending is basically not allowed. So outside of water, sewer, and broadband, and some very specific special infrastructure projects related to COVID-19, this money cannot be spent for other general infrastructure spending. Now, the one caveat is if you have that revenue reduction and you're claiming you have needs and spending money under that category of eligibility, that's a little broader. And potentially there are some things in there because it even says like roads, etc., that would fall under general government services, but only again to the extent you have that revenue reduction. And then you cannot use this money as a non-federal match for federal programs. So they're going to consider this federal money from a match perspective. So eligible public health uses, again, I'm going to kind of hit the high side of this. We can get into details as much as you would like when we get into the Q&A. We've got a ton of extra information pulled up to be able to reference as specific as you would like. But basically COVID-19 mitigation prevention, medical expenses. It talks specifically about providing additional assistance for those that are suffering from what's kind of referred to as long COVID or long-term health effects from COVID. So that's something to be aware of. Behavioral health care. So some of that is related to sort of the mental health impacts that COVID has had on certain communities and certain people. So again, I think that's a little open on what you could do. Public health and safety staff response and expenses to improve design and execution of public health programs. So again, I think anything you do to rework your public health programs, and it could be IT, it could be other types of things that you're doing basically in response to COVID, but also to better position yourself for future use, falls kind of under this category. I think one of the biggest things that we see now that we're seeing this transition into where we are is probably vaccine promotion and trying to drive the vaccine adoption process. It's definitely talked about in the guidance, and I think that's one of the things that is one of the clearest eligible uses of some of this at this point going forward. Negative economic impacts. So this is interesting the way it hits a lot of things that CARES Act kind of did, but it's the first time the money is going directly to municipalities. So you can do kind of the same thing that the state was doing with previous money. Assistance to unemployed workers, state unemployment insurance trust funds, assistance to households, expenses to improve economic relief programs. You can provide assistance to small business and nonprofits. You can rehire government workers, and you can provide that specific aid to impacted industries. Um, Now, there's some specific language in the guidance of talking about kind of what that is and how you determine how much you can do. The phrase they use is responds to. So first of all, as a recipient, if you're going to put money into these categories, you're going to have to identify what the need is, the negative impact, and identify specifically how the program that you're going to run with this or the assistance you're going to provide is going to identify that need or impact. And it has to be specifically in response to the disease or the economic consequences as a result of COVID-19. And basically, you're going to have to assess that connection and the extent and how the funding is going to do that. And you can't provide funding in excess of the harm that was caused. This is one where I wish we had the reporting requirements of how you're actually going to sort of address these issues. But you're going to have to really take a look at what it is impacted and how much that has cost from an economic standpoint to make that relate to what you're providing as assistance. And it looks like I got a question from Jessica.
Hey Seth, someone posted a question. Is there anything that shows we can use funds for parks and recreation? And I think this is kind of where an eligibility question could be asked about responding to negative economic impacts.
Yeah. And I think it's so I'll say maybe. So a couple of those are, it depends on, can we use that and consider parks and recreation as part of, especially, travel and tourism. So what kind of park function is this? Is it a, destination type park that you could argue that providing some assistance to them under some of these economic impact requirements could be allowed? I think the biggest thing would be, again, back to that revenue loss. So if you look at that and you had a revenue loss, certainly I think it's a general government service. And whatever that gap is, you could spend some money on parks and recreation. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be there from an infrastructure standpoint. So I think if you're trying to build a new park or expand parks, it may be difficult, especially if you don't have a revenue loss that's going to meet the requirements. But I think it's a really good question. I see another question there just briefly about the interest in trying to use qualified grant management entity, whether those are COGS or someone like us or consultants or whatever. It is not specifically addressed in the guidance of administration and how that would be necessarily eligible or not. I think that is a great question that needs to be probably brought up as part of a response to the guidance and their request that the interim rule receive comments, because I think that's one place where there's a significant lack of clarity in what's been put out so far about how those expenses would fall in. Where would it be? What eligible use would it be? And even for that matter, how much is there from an administrative standpoint that even the town could use to be able to cover their resources internally to do this? So not just getting outside parties, but to be able to offset your expenses and being able to administer this and implement some of these programs. But those are both really good questions. I was telling somebody earlier today, we got really three versions of stuff. I have stuff that's clearly eligible, I have stuff that's clearly not eligible, and we probably have a whole bunch of stuff that might be. And we're just not quite there yet. Some of them are going to need comments. Some of them are going to need clarification. Some of them I could probably say it's likely going to be or it likely won't be. That's one that's really just not addressed at all, unfortunately. So, that's kind of the beginning there. So one of the things, however, negative economic impacts. They have a real emphasis in the guidance in providing assistance to communities that were disproportionately affected as a result of COVID. And the way they're looking at it is really tends to be minority, low income communities. So think CDBG like. They reference specifically qualified census tracts or QCT in the guidance. And a lot of the things we're talking about kind of in this next section, I'm going to hit them pretty quickly, is things that would be eligible universally in a qualified census tract and in other areas of the community. So there's definitely a interest in providing very specific benefits to those kind of low, moderate income, certain socioeconomic classes, and others that have been disproportionately affected. So building stronger communities through investments in housing and neighborhoods is going to feel a lot like CDBG, things for supportive housing, stable, affordable housing, etc., vouchers, rent assistance, etc. Addressing educational disparities. Specifically, it talks about early learning services, think Head Start, and partnerships with other people, high poverty school districts to be able to provide gaps in funding. So, from a school district perspective, being able to provide assistance to help close gaps in funding between uh, higher poverty school districts and lower poverty. And additional educational services and practices. And I think this certainly comes into play when we're talking about the impacts that we've seen to students as a result of virtual learning and some other things in decline. So there's definitely some opportunities here to help pay for additional programs to help catch students up to where they should be from a grade level standpoint. And then promoting healthy childhood environments. Again, childcare type issues, home visiting programs to provide some additional assistance in those same areas. Again, from a guidance standpoint, it's very focused on those qualified census tract areas, but I think it's broader applicable than that. And another thing that it talks about in the guidance for almost everything we're talking about is that the information provided and the list of things eligible are non-exhaustive, and that there is flexibility beyond those examples that are provided for additional things that could be eligible as decided by communities. Again, there's not a process of how you document that or how you report that. So I would probably hang tight on trying to do those things until we get some more information. So that,
Seth, I have a
yep,
couple more questions
sure,
that
go
have
ahead.
come in for the negative economic
Yep,
impacts. So using uh, for recreation in response to public health, more specifically mental health,
yes,
an example of the pandemic providing that recreation is a very important aspect of our lives that is lacking.
yep.
Could that be potentially eligible or
Uh,
still kind of gray area?
I think it's a gray area. I like that type of thought process, and I think that's going to come in a lot as we try to get creative in some of these uses. Um, I feel like it's a little creative right now with what we know. But I like that tie, and that's a lot of this is what it's going to be when we get to the reporting and we get to justifying the money is how did we tie it to the intent of these programs as much as anything. So, if we could tie specific outside activities and some of those, again, I think especially if you're doing stuff in those qualified census tract areas, that is even better tie for some of these things. That's a great
Okay,
question.
couple more. What about using funds to increase the amount of affordable housing?
So I think if you go back to the affordable housing, I think that's definitely a possibility in the building strong communities. Um, so basically it says anything as services to address homelessness, supportive housing, access to housing. Um, I think there's a lot of options there of things that you can do to try to promote affordable housing and increasing the supply of that, including the development. It's a good
And then
question.
I think another, or maybe the final for this section is someone wants to renovate an existing facility so it can quickly be pressed into service for pandemic response, thinking like testing, quarantine, vaccination, hospital overflow. Would such a capital expenditure be allowable under the response category?
And I think the answer is maybe.
Maybe.
Um, the way things are written is they're very specific to COVID-19. Um, so if you could somehow tie it even to the existing pandemic and potential issues for, variants or changes in what we're experiencing, I think that helps strengthen that case. Um, I think it meets the intent, which is to be better prepared for these things. And I think if I go back to a couple of these, it kind of talks about that somewhere. And I've got some more detail that we can get into, and it gives some more detailed examples of all of these things. But I think That would, to me, in part, also fall under potentially the design and execution of health and public health programs, thinking about the future programs that you can use this for.
Okay. And sorry, one more came in. Revenue loss determination formula. It looks like it requires comparison to the last full fiscal year prior to COVID.
Yes.
For for us, that was a Hurricane Florence year. Any thoughts about using a different year?
Um, right now they don't provide any flexibility in that. It's very prescriptive in what you do. Again, I think that's a really good response to the questions being asked for the interim rule, to talk about the need to look at maybe not just one year, but averaging over multiple years to get a better feel of what those impacts really have. But one of the things it talks about in the revenue losses, which I think does apply to this, unfortunately, is you basically need to show that the revenue losses are basically related to COVID. So if there was revenue losses in some areas, same thing when you're talking about helping certain industries and stuff, you need to show that the impacts were truly related to the pandemic and not just continuing long-term impacts. You got some more flexibility with your personal revenue reductions, and the good thing is when you look into that, it also has a kind of a built-in increase every year. So it has like a 4.1% as the standard kind of escalation of the expectation of budget increases. So if you're under that, that's also a revenue loss. And you can either use your own numbers or the 4.1, whichever is higher. So for communities that haven't been seeing their budgets going up over time, that actually may provide the gap that they're looking for to some extent. All
There are
right.
a couple other questions
Okay.
on broadband, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, we're not quite there.
Yep.
We'll hit those after we get to infrastructure, because I'm going to try to keep plowing through this pretty quickly. Getting back to where we were, so premium pay again. I'm not sure how much this is really going to kind of come into play at this point, especially in those areas that have already basically opened back up, eased restrictions and everything else. But basically, you could provide premium pay to eligible workers that are providing essential work during the health emergency, or to provide grants to other employers with eligible workers who are providing essential work. I know a lot of places have already dropped premium pay, etc. There's some requirements on here. Basically, it's up to $13 an hour higher than their existing salaries, up to $25,000 per employee. It does start to trigger some things if those employees make 150% or greater of the annual income for the municipality or the state, kind of whichever of those is lower most likely. But I don't know how much this is really going to come into play at this point. So staff at nursing home, workers at farms, there's some things that are going to go into this. Like for instance, if you're doing premium pay, you actually have to be coming in contact with either other people in your organization on a daily basis. So remote workers, this is going to fall into that. It's going to have to be people are actually coming in contact with the public, or other workers that they have to come in contact to as part of their job, with some risks there involved. And I feel like this has probably kind of run its course in most places already. So I'm, kind of glad they put it in there. And, if we see something step back or other variants, it may come back into play again. But I don't really feel like it's probably a major use at this point. Um, so, again, it's got some respond to language. So it's got to basically be those that are doing the work physically there. And, it's got to be those that the costs associated were hardest to bear financially. So again, they're kind of looking at that being a little targeted as well. So revenue loss, we're kind of finally made it to that point. I don't want to get into the calculation because it is so specific for everyone. But basically, you're looking at your general revenue. So think your general fund for the most part. So the things that you collect from taxes, fees, other revenues that support general government services. You're not going to be able to look at revenue reductions in any of your utilities. Those are going to be separate and calculated outside of this. It's not going to include things like refunds and correcting transactions, anything having to do with your issuance of debt, sale of investments, private transactions, etc. And it will include, however, intergovernmental transfers between state and local governments. So think sales tax or some of those type things that you're going to get those that would come into play. However, it's not going to include some of the other things having to do with fiscal recovery funds. So it's very, very specific. There is some good examples, and there is all the calculations. Obviously, there's people out there, including ourselves, that are more than happy to help you make those determinations and do those calculations. There will be different kind of measuring points through the process. Basically, kind of every 6 months or so, that you can sort of measure your revenues and that revenue loss standpoint from that base year that we talked about earlier, which was that full year prior to the pandemic. So just because you haven't seen it yet, it could theoretically come into play still before all this money is gone. And it has the widest availability of things that you can do. So basically, government services is the way they define it, include things such as maintenance, pay-go funding, building of infrastructure, including roads, cybersecurity, hardware, software, protection of critical infrastructure, kind of all the things you see up here, including schools, police, fire, almost everything that you can think of from a general fund type standpoint that you may would spend money on. But again, you can only use money to the extent that you had the revenue loss. So if you have a revenue loss of $1 million, then $1 million worth of your funding can go towards this category, but that's as much as you could do. And again, it's not going to get into borrowing instruments and financial indebtedness. Um, so I'm not going to be able to use it for debt purposes. Um, were there any other questions before I jump to infrastructure on revenue loss?
Not on revenue loss. There's a
Okay.
couple of questions I have come in, but I think we can field
Okay.
those at the end.
Sounds good. So investments in infrastructure, and I do think this is going to be one of the biggest categories that people probably are going to put money in. It's probably the easiest category in some ways outside of the time constraints that we have. Most people have some substantial needs in this category as well. From a state statute standpoint, North Carolina, it's one of the broadest authorities that you have as a local government to probably spend money on, assuming that you have these utilities. Maybe not so easy for some of the county situations, but basically at the end of the day, it's a broad range of investments in water, wastewater, stormwater. I want to call that out specifically since they did define sewers, including stormwater and subsurface drainage systems, and broadband. There's a few terms in here that give me a little bit of pause, the way that they're included in both the rule and the guidance. So first of all is necessary investments, which includes projects that are required to maintain a level of service that in their terms meet applicable health-based standards. So I could see that from any type of public health standpoint, and that can include for wastewater or drinking water. But then it throws in things like taking into account resilience to climate change. And then it has some specific establishing or improving broadband service to unserved, underserved populations. Um, and it throws in, unlikely to be met with private sources of funds. My assumption is that was intended to apply to broadband primarily, for the eligibility of using that money. But it may be something to think about from a necessary investment standpoint to just tread a little carefully, especially if you're contemplating doing infrastructure to serve new development, and those type areas. It may be best to be a little cautious until we get some better clarification out of that. But at the end of the day, they broadly define water and sewer as anything that is eligible to receive funding through the Clean Water SRF or the Drinking Water SRF program. So if you're familiar with the state revolving fund programs, every state has their own version of it. Here in North Carolina, those administered by the Division of Water Infrastructure. I obviously worked there for many, many years before coming to WithersRavenel, so I'm very familiar with what those eligibilities are. What I will say is the state priorities and eligibilities can be and are in some places different than what is actually completely allowable by the federal rules. So just because the state doesn't fund that currently in your SRF program doesn't mean you couldn't use your money to do some of these things. Stormwater is a good example. It's eligible for using the Clean Water SRF fund in North Carolina. We're not really prioritizing stormwater work unless it's green infrastructure, but it's something that you can use this money for would be stormwater work, which is I think kind of an important thing to think about, especially as you try to think about using your money versus potential state money and the difference in those eligibilities as well. um, so that's kind of basically how it's tied up. So most things from a water wastewater side. So from wastewater, it's going to be collection systems, it's going to be treatment, works. I think it could include probably both point source and not and non-point source work. It could be decentralized systems as long as they're publicly owned. But it is going to tie to that publicly owned, even though it talks about that you can do work on private property. So that may give some opportunities to do some work on service lines that's generally not eligible, at least in the state standpoint, through the SRF programs with some of their requirements and limitations. Um, so again, maybe some additional things that you can do here you haven't been able to do in the past. Drinking water, again, storage, distribution, transmission systems, treatment, etc. One of the things to throw out there that they ask a specific question about is generally you can't do dams and reservoirs under the drinking water SRF, but they are actually asking that question in the guidance in the interim rule of should that be something that this money could be used for. So definitely comment if you think you may have a need to use this money for something related to dams or reservoirs having to do with drinking water sources or future sources. So take a look at that. One of the things it has, and I've got it underlined here, is it was intended to preserve flexibility, this is their words, for award recipients to direct funding to their own needs and priorities and would not preclude recipients from applying their own additional project eligibility criteria. Again, that language is in the guidance. I don't really see that wiggle room in the rule the way it's written right now, and that's all it says. I would like for them to provide some better, more detailed guidance and parameters around that of how, basically you could do your own thing as it falls in a little bit wider category than what's in the drinking water and the clean water SRF programs. Again, kind of all the same type of things. Um, Stormwater or subsurface drainage water is specifically called out. So think about that. Green infrastructures, you probably know about it in the state, reuse, rain gardens, wetlands, all those type things are all eligible uses as well. So, it's pretty broad on the types of things you can do. The other thing it specifically calls out is cybersecurity needs. We've seen some instances here in recently with different facilities. I know we have someone from Florida, and we had an issue in Florida not that long ago where there were some cybersecurity attacks. We obviously saw it in the pipeline here on the East Coast recently. So that is an option for spending some of this funds is to do some resiliency around, that type of infrastructure as well. And then broadband. Provides basically the ability and the interest in investing in broadband. It's designed to provide those services to underserved and unserved communities and households and businesses. So I think that's going to be key is the target towards those unserved or underserved households. The good thing from that standpoint is they're basically setting the threshold for broadband as synchronous 100 megabits per second. So that's up and down, which is a higher threshold than generally the state has looked at here in North Carolina for meeting the broadband requirement, or I think even like the FCC uses for broadband as well. The bad thing is if you're going to put that infrastructure in, then it's going to need to meet those requirements, or in a few specific cases, not necessarily meet at day one, meet a slightly lower threshold, but be able to scale to that higher level at build out basically at the end of the day. So there's a lot of flexibility in identifying the locations, the areas that need to be served for this. There's certainly a lot of need for this work. But again, it's going to have to be focused on those unserved, underserved areas. The other thing I will say is, be aware in North Carolina that there's restrictions on who can and can't fund broadband infrastructure in specifically counties generally aren't allowed to provide any broadband infrastructure outside of serving, their own kind of municipal facility. So they can't really use their funds for broadband the way the legislature has defined that in current statutes. Again, maybe they can open this up some when they do it. And this is the time to answer some of those broadband questions.
Yes, we have a couple of
Okay.
broadband and infrastructure questions. If a city has broadband available from multiple providers, what options are there for the city to spend ARP funds on broadband?
So I would say if the broadband exists in the areas as defined by this, then probably not. Again, they're looking at unserved and underserved, and there's another. I don't know if I threw it up here, but basically, there's also a provision saying that this is intended to be in those unserved and underserved areas where private, that's actually where it was. Let me go back one. Um, one more. That's where that underlined part at the second bullet here. Unlikely to be met with private sources of funds. So if you already have existing providers that are private that are providing the service, I don't think there's anything you could do here. Now, I think there's a possibility if you're providing subsidization related to some of the earlier categories for some of those, more disadvantaged, higher impacted communities and areas that you could provide some subsidy, but you're not going to be able to put broadband in.
Okay, next question. Money directly sent to municipalities can be used for water or wastewater treatment plant work, right? Treatment is
Yes,
included. So
absolutely.
um, there are some questions that came in privately, so I'm gonna get to those.
Okay.
There is I, the person asked that they've seen drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure and nothing on streets. Their main infrastructure necessity in their town is street maintenance. He sees no programs on grant funding available for that. Can these funds be used to assist in paving?
And the answer is no, with the exception of that revenue loss, where it specifically says you can, if you had a revenue loss, use those funds for road work. But outside of that category, these cannot be used, unfortunately, for any type of street work.
Okay, a couple more. Will this plan allow money to be given to homeowners that are building new houses or remodeling since the cost of material and equipment have increased due to COVID?
Wow, that's a really good question. I would think outside of the affordable housing provisions, I would say no. So unless it's falling under sort of that QCT and affordable housing provision, I don't think so.
Okay, and I think some came through the chat instead of the
Okay.
Q&A. Let me go through those two. If a neighborhood has flooding problems due to undersized infrastructure, can the city use ARP funds to correct the problem?
I think absolutely that would fall under the stormwater provision of infrastructure, and they could certainly use that for conveyance of stormwater as well.
All right, one more, and then there's some other questions that we can talk through timelines and
Okay.
reporting. Can cities use the ARP funds to replace water and sewer lines in a redevelopment area downtown?
Yeah, I think so. Again, I think any of that would probably fall under the eligibilities there, and I think that's fine.
Great, thank you, Seth. We got that a
Sure.
couple of times.
Okay.
I think that's all kind of infrastructure eligibility questions, so we can maybe move to the next section.
Okay. So let's talk about timelines a little bit. There's certainly a big concern when this first came out, and my hope was they would do something similar to what they did back in '09 with ERA, and they did to some extent. So, a couple things here. First of all, they defined the timeline for costs incurred from March 3rd of this year to December 31st of 2024. And we knew that December 31st, 2024 number, but we just got that beginning number along with the guidance in the interim rules. So anything that was incurred prior to March 3rd wouldn't be eligible, but basically things that you've done since then still could be paid for out of these funds. Up until December 34th. The other good thing is they acknowledge in the guidance that this is different than the CARES Act money. It has a different purpose, a different intent, especially with infrastructure. So they have defined costs incurred by December 31st, 2024 as being obligated. And obligated basically means that you are under contract for those services. So if you've gotten to the point, for instance, for an infrastructure project where you're under contract for construction, at that point you have obligated those funds as a community, and you've met the December 31st, 2024 deadline. And then you're going to have another 2 years until December 31st, 2026 to actually have a performance period to make sure you've expended all of those funds. Now, while that's good news, I'm certainly going to say um, expect the unexpected as we go through this process. We see issues today with getting materials, long lead times on projects, especially infrastructure. But other things as well. Expect, costs to go up, expect there to be timing issues. It's going to potentially be difficult to have all the assistance resources in the community to make these things a possibility, from engineering support to getting contractors to be able to do work. So try to take that into account. And make sure you've built in plenty of time for these deadlines, because everything may take a little longer. It may be harder to get under contract. So really, I would say do not push this too tight. And I think it's good to have kind of multiple plans at this point. Have a plan A, a plan B, and plan C that basically says this is what we'd like to spend the money on. But if we hit a roadblock, we know that when it's gone too far and we don't have time, and we got a plan B of how we can spend that money to make sure we don't lose it with any of these deadlines. So just kind of keep that in consideration as start planning on how you're going to use this money. Reporting. I threw a bunch up here. So there's reporting talked about. We basically know that the general type of reporting, but the guidance doesn't really, explain clearly what all is going to go into that report. So we will see. There's more reporting for states and for the larger municipalities, the entitlement communities, if you will, and the counties, since they're getting direct. They're going to have their own reporting directly to the federal government, to the Treasury Department. If you're a non-entitlement community that's getting that pass through the state, you'll have less reporting, but you're still going to have some reporting at the end of the day. You're basically going to have annual reports. If you're a non-entitlement, it looks like you're going to have quarterly if you're an entitlement, a county, or the state. And it looks like they're expecting the state to do most of the reporting on behalf of the smaller non-entitlement communities. But of course, the state's going to request information from those communities to be able to put those reports together. So, we'll see what it means at the end of the day. I would say let's tread carefully with the reporting right now until we get some more detail. But it's certainly going to be there. They always say they don't want it to be onerous, and they're going to try to keep all of these things to a minimum. I'll believe it when I see it with the federal government. Again, that's not a knock. But there's going to be a lot of criticism of programs like this. There always are. There's going to be people wanting to get enough data to prove that it was successful and very beneficial, and there's going to be other people trying to get the data to prove that it was a waste of money. They're going to be competing kind of from a political level for money like this. So just be prepared. The reporting may change over time as there's new questions being asked. So just kind of, I'd say hold tight on the reporting and understanding of that right now. Hopefully we'll know more in the next 60, 90 days. So, another thing I felt it was worth mentioning is there's things that they specifically say that are encouraged but not required. Um, so the way I read that right now is, just because they encourage it doesn't mean you have to do it. But again, also keep in mind that these rules are in an interim stage. So it doesn't mean they can't change the rules to require some of these things. So again, I think there's going to be some caution in appropriating this money too quickly. I think it's good to get yourself in position to be able to appropriate it quickly, but I might want to hold off a little bit until we have a few more details. Just broadly before I talk about these, the good news is it doesn't look like there's a lot of federal conditions required. There's not Davis-Bacon, there's not American Iron and Steel or Buy American or things like that. Um, it doesn't look like there's specific disadvantaged business solicitations that have to happen. It doesn't look like there's any environmental requirements. So that's all good news at this point. But again, there's these other things they kind of throw out there. So some of the things that they encourage but don't require is engaging with the public and basically figuring out how you're going to spend the money. They encourage you to provide assistance to those that are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, especially again in the guidance talking about those qualified census tracts. They encourage you to ensure that water and sewer broadband projects use strong labor standards, which sounds a lot like Davis-Bacon. But again, it's just, you know, something you should consider. They ask you to consider projects to replace lead service lines. That comes up a couple times in infrastructure. Consider green infrastructure investments. Something to point out is some of these things are requirements in ERA. So I'm not surprised to see them mentioned. I'm glad to see they're not required at this point and they're just considerations. They consider you they want you to consider ways to integrate affordability options into the broadband program design. That makes it sound like there's some thoughts into subsidization and other things possibly in that program that they want you to think about, and to prioritize support for broadband networks that are owned, operated, or affiliated with local governments, nonprofits, or co-ops. That's a little bit of a loaded topic here in North Carolina. I know that there's some cities that have their own broadband. There's a small handful. I know Wilton's one of them. And there was some pushback from the legislature to basically allow, people to do a lot of that, and they wanted to keep it in the private market. So don't know there's much you can do from that standpoint anyway. But it's again, it's in that list of we encourage you to do these things, but they don't appear to be required currently. So what can you do right now? And after this, we'll go back into questions and try to answer a few more here. And I can hang around a little bit longer than our deadline. If people have questions, I'll try to answer them as long as we can. Identify eligible needs. Again, I think be flexible right now. Identify multiple needs in multiple categories would be my recommendation so that you can kind of prioritize them and have some plan Bs if for some reason there's issues from timing with, kind of your primary need. If you're going to do public input, this is the time to start doing public input. Have some information sessions, talk about the funding, what it can be used for, the things you're talking about using it for. Obviously, start bringing your elected officials into the discussion as well, so that you know that you have their input on what they're wanting to spend this money on and how to allocate that, and make sure you've got their buy-in when it's time for these to move so that you don't get any hangups anywhere from that standpoint. Take a look at your capital improvement plans, use the good ones that you've got to help identify, especially water and sewer projects. Maybe update them if you haven't in the last, couple years to make sure you really do know what your priorities are before you start spending money. I think it's good to identify the gaps between the direct funds that you're receiving and potential state funds. Um, we don't know what the state's going to prioritize these monies for. I suspect the way the guidance is written, and if they decide to send it through the Division of Water Infrastructure, they'll probably lean heavily on the existing priority systems that they use for drinking water SRF and clean water SRF. So they're going to prioritize, rehabilitation type projects, old infrastructure, specific public health issues, kind of what you would expect. Probably not going to, heavily emphasize things like stormwater, and maybe some other things. So just think about that, because you may want to use your funding for the things the state isn't going to make money available for, and try to use the state money for some of those other just sort of base water and sewer projects, for instance. Um, Another thing you may want to consider is, we'll talk about it in the preparation, but you may want to start funding some of the, planning, design, getting ready infrastructure projects, if that's, kind of what you need to do that are high on your list to be able to utilize the state money. I don't know what, they're going to consider in their priorities, but I'm sure there's going to be some component of essentially shovel readiness because they have these deadlines as well. So, back in era, they wanted it to be basically designed and permitted before they committed money to make sure it was actually going to get to construction to meet the deadlines. I don't know if they'll be as aggressive because we have kind of this 2-year window instead of a 1-year window, but I think they're still going to want some assurance that this money can move quickly. So if you can start doing some work on these projects to get them ready or get them back and ready if they were on the shelf before, I think that's potentially a good use of your money as well. If you can spend a little of your money to get a bunch of the state's money, that's a pretty good decision. Um, Review those state priorities, see where you think you would fit in. We do a lot of preliminary scoring for people as part of normal funding rounds. I'm sure there's people, including us, that can help you with that to try to figure out where you think you might be. I think we'll have a better feel from the state probably, within another 30, 45 days. I suspect that the legislature will take up all of this consideration as part of this budget session. And we'll have something hopefully prior to, July, August timeframe at least. Um, and we'll know how much money they're putting in where and how it's going to be spent, hopefully. And that gets back to that kind of middle thing here, as I'd say prepare for additional guidance and clarification. Kara Malanzi is a great source of information with the School of Government as a legal counsel, and she certainly recommends thinking very careful about appropriating funds at this point, until we just know more about reporting, know more about some of these requirements. I think you can get yourself in position to use them, but I would just tread carefully in actually starting to spend this money, again, in the next 30, 60 days. I would kind of hold tight a little bit to make sure we really understand what the requirements are going forward so that you're ready for it. Last thing you want to do is have to pay money back that you've already spent. And then I've just got a list of resources here as we'll go to other questions. The U.S. Department of Treasury website, this is where the interim rules at, where the guidance is. You can find this information. You can find the links to be able to submit comments. Again, I urge you to do so. They're actually actively asking for them. It's a different process because they're trying to get this out quickly and implemented, which is why they basically are saying it's out, it's in effect. However, we're still refining them. And, just expect that's how this process is going to work. They'll come out with something final probably later this year. There'll be more guidances. They'll get different interpretations, and we'll just kind of, navigate this process over the next 12, 24 plus months to, just kind of go along with them. And hopefully we'll see responsiveness and understanding the needs that are in communities and letting communities set their own needs. The North Carolina Pandemic Recovery Office, if you haven't requested your funds yet as a non-entitlement community, you need to do that as soon as possible. The pre-contracting checklist is up there. The portal to their website to be able to upload your information to get your funding is there, and they're trying to move it as quickly as possible because they have requirements for the federal government as well. UNC School of Government, they have some great information. Coach Cannons has a lot of great legal stuff. I'll call it in specifically Kara Malanzi. She has information already about some of this guidance as well. And more importantly, she put out a document a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, about what is actually allowable under state law for communities to be able to spend this money on. So regardless of what the federal government says is eligible, it may not be something you in the state of North Carolina are eligible to be able to spend your money on. So great resource as these questions continue to get asked and taken up. I'm sure she'll have information on legislation. And a shout out to the NC League of Municipalities. They have a specific ARP website they keep updated with guidance and input. And, assuming you're a member there, I think they're also providing their input back to the federal government as well. So really good resources out there. I use all of these and then some. And certainly we're a resource. We'll be putting out some additional webinars as we get more clarification and providing, support this whole way as well. And I think we're ready to go to questions now.
Sure, and I just wanted to make a general statement first. There's been some questions about the presentation, if it will be available afterwards. And yes, we will plan on distributing
Yeah,
the presentation, and it is being recorded, so that will be out in some capacity soon.
absolutely.
Um, so we've got a lot of questions that have come in kind of about
Okay.
all the different topics that you've discussed today. So some of them came in privately and some you can see in the chat too, but does a municipality need to stay in a state of emergency to spend the fund?
No, I don't see any requirements for a state of emergency to use this funding.
Okay, next question. Would premium pay be allowed for workers such as customer service and other municipal services that do have required interaction with customers and the public?
And I think I touched on that. So basically, there is required in-person interaction. I think it is something that you could do premium pay for. Look at it specifically again. I feel like some of the things they talk about in the guidance kind of have fallen by the wayside with the easing of restrictions here in North Carolina, especially. But I think that's the type of things that were intended to be used for premium pay. So I would say yes. Just make sure how you're justifying it from a reporting standpoint.
Okay, and a couple of stormwater questions.
Okay.
Can these funds be used to assess the condition of our stormwater system?
One of the big kind of holes in this to me is there's not clear money for doing, um, for lack of a better term, asset management type work. I think that would be a really good use of some of this funds as an investment in the long-term operation and maintenance of facilities. It's not addressed in any way in the information. So I'd say its lack of um, existence in the guidance, I would lead towards no, unless you're doing that work specifically to generate a project that you're using the money on. So I think if you were to go, so in this case, if you were to go out and do some assessment work and camera work and that type of thing, and the purpose of that is also generating a project that you're going to use this money, I would say under the SRF criteria, that's probably an eligible expense for the project. If all you're doing is going out and doing assessment work, I would be really hesitant without getting some type of determination directly from Treasury.
Great. And I know we're over the time, but we do have a couple
Yeah.
more questions. The city has property that floods during heavy rains. Can we use the funds to put in ditches or to clean out existing ditches?
Um, Maintenance is a little iffy. I would say if you have a revenue loss, maintenance activities would be eligible, which is what I would consider cleaning. I don't think cleaning is going to be eligible under the infrastructure improvements under the SRF criteria. I think putting in new ditches, doing, natural drainage swells type, if that's what we're talking about, are certainly eligible as a stormwater and even a green infrastructure feature.
Okay, another question. Do we have to wait to receive the funds before expending them? And I know you touched on this briefly, but I just want to
So
come in
I,
a couple times.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to defer. The real answer for that is for them to be eligible to use for that, I would say no. However, I'm also going to defer to state law when it comes to expenditures and funding of making sure you actually have that money and it's in your budget currently for usage, and it's been approved appropriately. So, from a standpoint of the ARP money, even things you've already spent, since it goes back to the March 3rd, are considered eligible expenses. So I think you could reimburse yourself for money that you've already spent on things after March 3rd. Um, I don't think there's any issues with that, but I'm not going to tell you whether you meet all the other requirements from a state budgeting standpoint. But great question.
Sure. And then when might we start applying for this to the state for funding? I'm
Uh, you
assuming
know,
probably the fall, but I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
my guess is they're probably going to try to do something in the fall. All of this has come out in the last week or so. I expect this to be a topic of conversation in the next State Water Infrastructure Authority meeting. And, the biggest question at this point is who is going to administer the money for the state? Because that's really up to the legislature. So nothing can really move on that until the legislature makes a decision. Um, I'm assuming things are going to move very quickly when they do. Assuming it goes to the Division of Water Infrastructure, I would be really surprised that they don't try to start taking applications before the end of the year for some of this funding. Again, I can't speak for them, but what we've seen historically is they like to break that up into multiple rounds because not everybody's going to be ready day one. It'll be, depending on how much money's available, there's probably a different answer if it's 200 million or a billion, and how they distribute it and over what time period. So I think that's a lot of that is left to be determined. My expectation would be is this fall sometime there's going to be applications to start accessing that funding.
Okay, and I have three more questions that have come
Okay.
through. Can an entity transfer their grant funds to another entity?
So there is the ability to transfer grant funds to basically nonprofits. If you're a county, you can give it to other units of local government, certainly within your county. So yes, there are some provisions for doing that. They're kind of specific. I can talk about those if you want to follow up with a very specific instance. But yes, there are provisions for being able to transfer that funding, and all the requirements would also transfer with that to the other entity from timeline and everything else.
Okay. Any recommendations on how regional systems can upgrade or expand their water or wastewater infrastructure using ARP funds? Can they apply directly to the state for COVID funds?
So again, that's kind of what we were talking about a minute ago. You know, yes, the answer is likely you're going to be, um, you know, sending applications for this funding to the state, likely starting this year and maybe over the next, 2 years even at this point. Um, we'll see what the monies are and what goes into that, but they have long been proponents of regionalization and working together for stuff. Also, don't be surprised if the state's trying to figure out how to target some of this money in North Carolina to distressed units and to the viable um, utility reserve. So, you may see some promotion of this into some of those programs as well. And I expect you will as they try to figure out what's eligible too. And I'll say, I think the state's going to have a vested interest in, is this money eligible for things like asset management, rate studies, etc., because of some gaps in the viable utility program where they would love to use some of this money to do some of those same things as well. But yes, you could use your own money as a regional system, and you're likely going to be able to get money from the state as well.
Great. Two more questions. Will building additional water booster stations and accompanying water lines to better serve county drinking water customers qualify?
Yeah, I think that falls
Absolutely.
under the SRF and certainly eligible for that infrastructure funding.
Okay, the last question we have is pretty specific. In Treasury's published FAQ document, number 15 says addressing health disparities and the social determinants of health are permissible, and the listed eligible services includes remediation of lead paint or other
Yep.
lead hazards.
Yep.
I take this to mean I can remove lead contaminated abandoned structures. Any thoughts?
That's a really good question. Now, I would have said yes to everything until you said abandoned. Um, I think that's going to be the way you tie that directly to public health if it's been abandoned. So is there a public health issue since no one's living there at this point? I think certainly lead-based paint, lead service lines, they talk about that a lot. So they're interested in people spending money on those things. Um, I would say it's how you tie that specifically to public health. I think the ability is there. It's how you make that justification.
Last question that just came in, and then is there a cap, like a maximum funding amount per project applicant unit of government for using these funds?
So, obviously, I think we're talking about like getting state money at this point. My guess
Yes.
would be yes. Um, Again, it's going to depend on whether we're talking, 100 million or a billion, of what caps would be. Generally, what has kind of been done in the past, and I can only speak about what was done in the past, is they tend to try to limit the amount of money per unit applying per round, while also leaving themselves the options if they don't get enough applications to provide more funding than what those limits are. Assuming this is going to be 100% grant money, and I would expect it would be given what it is and the need to move it quickly. I think there will likely be caps. No idea, what those might be. I would say stay tuned, and we'll certainly again. I think likely our next webinar is probably as soon as we get some clarification from the state on where the money's coming from and what that process and timeline may be in the application process. I think we'll probably have another webinar as soon as possible when we get some clarification to answer those questions.
Sure. There are no other questions in the Q&A section or the chat or sent to me privately. So
Okay.
I don't know if there's any additional questions if anybody wants to type in, but
Well, we're certainly here to help. There's a lot of people out there that are, including some of those other resources I shared. More than happy to answer any of your questions or provide any assistance we can. We'll be here the whole way. Like I said, we'll be reaching out and trying to do as much of this as we can, but feel free to contact me directly. Jessica, it may be me or Jessica that respond back, but we'll be glad to answer any questions you have. And if there's any assistance you need, that's what we're here for. But we really appreciate, um, you being a part of this today. Sorry it ran a little long, but we wanted to answer as many questions as we can. It's still pretty dynamic and changing. Again, we know a lot more than we did 2 weeks ago. I'm hoping we know a lot more 60 days or so from now. But if we get any more questions at this point, we'll respond to them. We'll try to follow up directly with those. Feel free to reach out to us. Like I said, that's what we're here for, and we're glad to help any way we can. But again, thank you so much for being here today, and we look forward to working this process with you guys. And we'll follow up with the recorded version of this hopefully shortly. So we have recorded this, and we can make all of this information available. So y'all have a great day.